I can have sight of what's going on the webinar. And for the moment, can I also check if there are already attendees at the webinar as well?
We have 188 people online at the moment.
Perfect. So if that's the case, good afternoon, everybody, especially those who are attending online at the moment. Thank you so much for your commitment today. This is the kickoff of the Education 4.0 Advanced Best Practice in partnership with MDEC and the Ministry of Education. We will be starting at 3:30 p.m. so Malaysia time. And so it will be starting in the next 15 minutes. So I really appreciate your patience. Thank you so much for jumping in early. And in the meantime, do excuse us testing a few things. We'll be testing the presentations and the audio in the background.
So Sri, we are trying to find Dr. Marzita.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if she's logged in together with Miss Rashida, or she's logging in from Dr. Marzita.
No, I'm here, Rashida here. Dr. Marzita will come in shortly.
Okay. Thank you so much, Miss Rashida.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
So Debbie is I see Dr. Marzita there. It's under Marzita, Marzita.
Yep, found her.
Cool.
And she's meant to be a co-host as well as.
Yeah, it's just her left to be the panelist. Then we are all set.
Okay.
I think Dr. Marzita is. Yeah, she's in a panelist, so all yours.
Perfect. Good afternoon, Dr. Marzita. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope, can we just test your audio and your video? Assuming he's just still dialing in.
Hello, hi. Zita here.
Hi, Dr. Marzita.
Hi.
Perfect. I can see you. Okay, great. So thank you so much for joining us today. So I just, as an introduction, my name is Sri and I'm from the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. And online, we also have Professor Damian from Deakin University and a few others from Deakin University as well. And Ben Arnold, as well as Debbie. Perfect. So I really appreciate your time today. We will be starting at 3:30. Can I, again, just test your audio really quickly?
Just here in Geelong. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect. Yes, I can hear you very well, Professor Damian. And then,
Hi. Yeah, Marzita here. Marzita here. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, it sounds good.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So just for everyone's awareness, so I will be kicking off absolutely immediately at 3:30. There's a few people coming in already at the theater. So we will pan over across to the theater room at some point so you can see. For those who are online, thank you so much for joining us again. And like I said, we will begin in the next few minutes.
It's nice to meet you, Dr. Marzita. I hope all is well where you are at the moment.
Hello, hi.
Six a.m. here
Yeah.
in Melbourne, so, and Geelong. Have you had lots of rain today or a sunny day?
Rainy here.
Is it?
Yeah.
Mm. We've had lots of rain here too. Most of the east coast of Australia's been getting a lot of rain, and we've had a lot of floods. Unfortunately, yeah, unusual.
No, so I was gonna. So, for the sake of everyone who's in online, Erwin, would you mind just panning across to the theater so everyone can see?
Everybody.
There you go. Yeah, thank you, Erwin.
Hi, Debbie. Can I trouble you to move Sri up to panelist? Thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry, I need assistance to move Sri Austrade to the panelist so she can see the Q&A as they come in.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bit of a lag there. Not quite sure why it's not letting me add her.
Sorry, come again?
It's not letting me add her in.
Ah, okay. Um,
Owen, can I just check that process for asking questions again?
Yes, so Sri will be moderating the questions. I will be managing with her as questions come in, and we will address the questions to you, and you will take them as you see fit. Is that okay?
Yep. And you'll ask those questions through audio?
Yes, correct. So it'll be audio, and the camera will be on the theatre, so you can see Sri as you interact. And because we also have limited time, so we'll pick and choose the Q&A, whichever has the most impact.
Terrific. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
I have a feeling we have a capped limit for the panelist. I can't actually add Shri.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today again, and appreciate your patience. We're just waiting for another 2 minutes and then we'll get started. It's for those who are online, surprisingly, it's raining. So it's a few people that we're just waiting for, and then we'll make sure to get started on time at 3:30. We really appreciate it. Please, thank you. Please don't worry to take a seat in the front. We promise, we will bite. Very Right. So let's begin, I think. So thank you again for joining us for the Education 4.0 Advanced Best Practice series delivered in partnership with the Malaysian Digital Economy Corporation, as well by the Ministry of Education in Malaysia. We appreciate all those attending today's session as we kick off the series of 4 training webinars for school teachers and educators. My name is Sri Gunasilan, and I'm from the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, and I will be your MC for today. For those attending in person, it's great to see so many faces in the theatre, and we thank you for joining us in person. For those attending online, we thank you for your commitment and hope you find this a highly productive webinar. May I take a moment to acknowledge my colleague Erwin, as well as Debbie Rutley in Australia, and the rest of the Deakin Australia team who have been instrumental in setting up this hybrid event. May I also add a thank you to Professor Damian, who will be helping with the slides as well. So with that, next slide, please. Perfect. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. To reduce the background noise, all microphones have been muted apart from the person speaking. And please note that audio quality may fluctuate throughout the webinar. This session is being recorded and may be provided to you, to all participants, and attendees who are not in agreement may exit now. All attendees will be provided a copy of the presentation along with a digital copy of a certificate of attendance via email within 2 weeks. At the end of the session, the panel will be taking questions. In order to ask a question, though, you simply type your question in the Q&A function for those attending online. And we will read the question at the end. Hopefully, we have some time available. And for those, but we would still love to hear from you, so please use the chat function. And I noticed that you already have, which is great. And there will be a Deakin team will be responding accordingly. Don't worry, for those of you who are here and on the floor, there are roaming microphones as well. So we'll make sure to allow some question times as well. Now, welcome. Next slide, please. For Mr. Paul Sander, the Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner for Austrade, Malaysia, and Brunei, who will be providing welcome remarks. Paul, may I welcome you to the podium?
Thank you very much, Sri. It's my honour and privilege to say a few words to everyone today. Good afternoon, salam petang. Ms. Sophia, a friend of mine, tested my Bahasa Melayu a little bit. I was very embarrassed to only know a few words, so I decided I would show off with a good afternoon. Great to see.
Recording in progress.
It's great to see everyone online, our participants and educators, as well as those of you who made the effort to us here, and a very, very warm welcome to the Australian High Commission. It's great to see you here. I won't read a long list of our VIPs that are here or online with us today, because my view is that we're all VIPs. But what I will say is to acknowledge representatives from MDEC, our very, very good friend MDEC. Thank you for your efforts. The Ministry of Education, also strong representation and help, and also our friends at Deakin. Thank you very much for your support and participation. This is the first training workshop in our Education 4.0 Advanced Best Practices series. It's the series of professional development training for Malaysian teachers. I'm really pleased to let you know that despite the challenges of the past few years, the Australia-Malaysia relationship remains very, very strong. It's vital, both essential and full of energy and opportunity. It's a great time to be part of the Malaysia-Australia relationship. We have the honour to be partnering once again, with our dear friends at the Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation, MDEC, and the Ministry of Education. We're very, very proud of the unique partnership that we have with MDEC. It continues to deliver collaborative projects of relevance to the Malaysian government and other related agencies. It's a partnership that seeks to uplift trade and education opportunities and deepen collaboration between our growing digital economies. Deakin University, our Australian partner on the event, was established in 1974 as Victoria's fourth university at a location in Geelong near Melbourne. I think that's correct, isn't it? Yeah, good. Glad I got that right. Deakin is one of the 4 world-class Australian universities you will hear from in this series. It's one of Australia's leading tertiary education providers and is among the top % of universities worldwide. Deakin has a proud history of working closely with industry and being grounded in the real world industrial landscape, also being a leader in distance and online education. I know this because I've personally had experience of their online education modules over my course of my career. It's therefore fitting that we come together with a leader in driving innovation and digitalization and the Ministry of Education expertise. Importantly, these events are about seeking ways to manage change and disruption. We know too well from personal experience the impact that the pandemic and other global uncertainties continue to have on our general well-being. The opportunity to come together in forums such as these to share expertise and just spend time together is a great way of adapting to challenging, changing times. A great way to build resilience and the skills necessary for a better future. Note that Deakin refers to its own strategic plan in setting out an optimistic future powered by ideas to enhance social, cultural, economic, and importantly, environmental well-being. To achieve these very fundamental operational goals, it is obvious that educators, teachers play a critical role. In fact, we won't to achieve an optimistic future without educators and the knowledge that they impart to their students. Working together to constantly strive to raise the quality of teaching, particularly across topics of current relevance, is a very, very worthwhile pursuit. Managing change, managing risk, AI, OIT, data analytics, for instance, and extremely importantly, fostering an interest in STEM from preschool through to secondary school and beyond are priorities for many economies around the world, including, of course, Malaysia and Australia. This series has demonstrated partnerships such as these yield constructive benefits with Malaysian and Australian educators. For those of you with us in the theatre today, you will have the opportunity to meet with Ms. Brigan, our international manager, and Associate Professor Wanti Wijaja. Thank you. Professor of Education and Head of School, I'm just getting the right here, International Partnerships with Deakin School of Education. We are very, very pleased that both of them have managed with us today. Welcome. For those joining us online, please do take the opportunity, ask as many questions, and I note we've already got 29 questions there, so it's going to be a busy afternoon, but please keep those questions coming, and we'll of course endeavour to answer all, if not today, then in follow with you personally. It's my honour and privilege to spend some time with you today. I wish you all an extremely productive session. Thanks to everyone who have made this event possible, but my sincere and very important thanks go to my colleague Sri and my colleague Owen, who've been tireless in their pursuit of excellence in terms of the series. So thank you. May I add our special appreciation to Dr. Mazita, the Ministry of Education, who will be officiating the series. Thank you very much and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm remark. Next slide. Joining us online. Oh, just waiting for it. Perfect. Ooh. One slide too far.
Oh, there we go.
Joining us online and officiating the series today, may I welcome Beruasa, Dr. Marzita Binti Abu Bakar, the Deputy Director for Teacher Professionalism Division of the Ministry of Education, Malaysia. Dr. Marzita, are you with us? Can we hear you?
Yes, thank you, Sri. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. A very good evening and selamat petang to Mr. Prof Sanda, Minister, Councillor, Commercial and Senior Trade, Investment Commissioner, Malaysia and Austrade, CS Nick Naharuddin bin Muhammad Nasir, Director, Digital Talent from MDEC, Associate Professor Dr. Wanti Wijaja from Deakin University, Miss Brigan, International Manager, Deakin International, respective school leaders and teachers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for having me here at program Advanced Education 4.0 Digital Learning Best Practices Series. I'm honored to be a part of this gathering of dedicated school leaders, educators and stakeholders in digital learning education. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude, congratulate Austrade and MDEC for hosting this one event. Ladies Gentlemen, I believe that all of you will go through the series professional development and of webinar. Today will be the first lab. I believe that by participating in this webinar, we are in the right place and the right time. Together, let us accelerate an exchange of ideas and scaling up of good practices. On behalf of the Ministry of Education Malaysia, I would like to say my deep gratitude to all the participants for your positive participation in this event. Ladies and gentlemen, people's lead curriculum development, so it's essential to understand the use of digital technologies to not only support but also transforming. However, it's well understood that focusing on technology alone will not change learning practices or outcome. Technology can be used to repackage but not transform existing practices. The responsibility for realizing the potential of digital technologies relies on school knowledge, understanding, and strategic outreach. School leadership has become a priority in education policy agendas. School leaders, they must strive to fill gaps in their technological knowledge and skill in order to provide direction and guidance to lead digital development in their school and spread this practice to the school's learning environment. MOE has been putting effort in developing the skill and confidence of school leaders and educators in the appropriate of effective use of digital technology, support learning and teaching. Our educators, the digital technology itself, that will be the key to delivering improved educational outcomes for our children and young people. Children and young people will get the most out of digital technology when it is skillfully deployed to support their learning. It is vital, therefore, that our educators have skills, confidence, and knowledge to know when and how to digital technology can be deployed effectively. This webinar program Advanced Education for Digital Learning Best Practices serve as an exemplar of education, innovation, and collaboration in Southeast Asia and bringing experts from different time zones in an innovative platform. Webinar ensure discussion and sharing of our innovations on the current trends in digital learning and managing major change and providing benchmark move forward for integrated digital education. The MOE continues to provide support for teachers to ensure given the opportunity to acquire knowledge and on online teaching and learning. Finally, on behalf of MOE, I would like to express my appreciation to all the participants for taking your time out of busy duties to attend all the seminars. I believe all the session will benefit leaders and teachers in Malaysia. They are confident in enhancing their skills in teaching. Again, I would like to thank and congratulate Austrade and MDEC for your generosity in organizing this outstanding event. On behalf of MOE, I would like to especially announce the opening of the program Advanced Education for Digital Best Practice. I wish you all a very, very successful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marzita. Kind words and for officiating series. This is not possible without the Ministry of Education. And on behalf of us and the MDEC team who have been working on the project, including myself, thank you and the Ministry of Education for your ongoing support. I understand you have a few meetings after this and may be able to stay for the full duration. Thank you so much again for your officiating. Next, please. So without much further ado, I welcome the Australian education expert for today's session on leading change, strategy and change in education, Professor Damian Blake, the head of school for education in Deakin University. Professor Damian has extensive experience in program development across education fields, including applied learning, initial teacher education, higher education, professional and vocational education. Professor Damian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sri. And can I also express my deep gratitude and honour in being able to present to you today some ideas that I hope you find helpful, and also to Austrade, to the Ministry, and to MDEC as well for bringing this all together and making this possible. I have been to Malaysia several times. I wish I could be there amongst you, and have many wonderful stories which I could share with you, but we won't have time for those. So I will jump straight into our discussion about strategy and change in education. And I just wanted to acknowledge also Dr. Ben Arnold, who is also on the panel. Dr. Ben is our course director and one of our leading researchers as well within leadership education as well. So welcome to Ben too. Today's presentation, I'll just begin by acknowledging the country on which that I located. I am in Geelong, which is the home of Deakin University. As Paul said earlier, Deakin University started on these grounds and these communities, but long before Deakin University, our First Nation peoples walked these lands and educated our community and children. And I just wanted to acknowledge those First Nation people who are the traditional custodians of the lands throughout Australia, who for many years have educated young people in our communities, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging as well. So the contents of today, I'm going to talk about some of the big challenges in education, drawn on the educational research, some recent education research that has been talking about that. And one of the reasons why I'm keen to focus on some of these challenges is because significance in thinking about planning a vision for your school or your community, your education community, and also planning change and strategy to bring about change in those contexts. It's often a thing that many leaders don't satisfactorily acknowledge or briefly acknowledge in terms of the challenges. And I also wanted to highlight some approaches that you can use once you start to acknowledge those challenges, because sometimes, the notion of setting strategy and change is more than just about what you're doing, at your local, within your local community. So I'll talk about those implications of those big challenges, and also summarize with some important highlights for strategy and change as well. So let's start with the first slide and just thinking about leadership itself. And I have a couple of propositions to make, and amongst us today online and on location in the theaterette there, no doubt we have many school leaders, leaders at the principal level, leaders in a pedagogical sense, leading change, developing new ways of teaching and learning, using digital tool to help support learning and many other things. And I think one thing that is commonly accepted now by many people in the field of education is that our education leaders are now thought to be amongst the most accountable people in terms of students' overall achievement. And often those achievements are measured against some significant priority progress measures. And often people talk about wanting change, not just from within our schools, but within our community, within our governments, within our nations. And often, this slide is an interesting one because it captures some of the irony in that. Who wants to change? Everyone wants to change something. Who wants change? Who wants to change themselves? Often that's where the rubber hits the road, as they say, thinking about, well, that if you want change, then we all have to do something different. But then the next big question is, well, who wants to lead that change? And often you see that there's nobody in that cartoon there, and it is a cartoon, but it does capture a little essence of truth there, that leading change is a difficult thing, and leading change in education is a challenge. And in fact, it has many challenges, and that's what I want to talk about, and the significance of those for planning, strategy and change. So, I mean, the point being that leaders are accountable, but they also must lead change. The added challenge is the increasing understanding that our education leaders have roles that have become significantly more complicated. And when you look at the definition of the word complicated, as opposed to the definition of the word leadership, because there's many definitions of leadership, but it's actually more interesting to look at the definition of complicated, because that's what the role has become. You see that complicated looks at, well, you can have consisting of parts that are intricately combined, such as a complicated recipe or complicated machinery. So there's elements of that does apply to think the complications involved as, leadership roles, but also, around, complication being difficult to analyze, understand, explain, as in a complicated issue or an absurdly complicated life. So there's no complication, leadership being a complicated field to be in, does capture an essence of some of those challenges. And often the essence includes many things are happening at once, and many of those things are interrelated. And I'd like to focus on a bit of that in particular today, and to think about, the implications for leadership and change. So educational leaders do need to lead strategy and change, though, if things are going to improve, and they are accountable not just for the results, they are accountable for creating the plans, setting the strategy, setting the vision and the plans, and setting the strategy, and then implementing those operational plans that arise from that. And that definition is a part of the leadership role that you play. Now, that could be as the senior leader, as a principal, for example, in school, or it could be a departmental leader, leading one of the elements of the faculty within a school, and so on. But they are required to lead strategy and part of their leadership role. But interestingly, the research, globally is quite strong in that many leaders also talk about limit formal preparation and limit professional learning that is really helpful in addressing many of those aspects of the role. So I thought today it'd be useful to break down some of those aspects, to highlight areas, particularly in the challenges where, that professional learning, is important, more important of those elements of the role that are important for strategy and change. So acknowledging challenges is probably the first part of actually setting a strategy and developing an approach to changing our community. So educational leaders face a broad range of unique and situated challenges, problems that influence their capacity to lead strategic change. And when I talk about situated challenges, I'm talking about each of your local contexts that you're working within, but also the amount of prior experience and learning that you might individually bring to the context sets up the strategy for change. Some leaders are new in their role, some leaders have been in their roles for quite a long time, some came into their role because they were very successful teachers and found themselves as school leaders, for example. Others were born school leaders to some extent. So it's interesting how people come to the roles of school leader, but they're all accountable in terms of the strategy and change. But from this presentation, I'm arguing that it's to acknowledge these challenges as a starting point in leading strategy and so let's draw on some of the research. And there was a very significant piece of research done and published just recently, which looked at 17 years of research projects and publications that were relating to school leadership. And interestingly, much of that research was increasing in the most recent, up to 2019. So this goes up to 2019. There has been more since, but you'll find that out of the 150 documents that were analysed for this scope review on research and assessing leaders from 45 different countries, there were some quite significant themes that were emerging as challenges and problems for leaders when they're confronting leading strategy and change. So let's unpack those a little bit. And the first two in particular are drawn from the research, and I'll talk about the third later on. But the research identified many challenges and problems that are faced by leaders and bracketed them to two broad areas. Now, in the first area, you can think about the problems and the challenges arising from the complex nature of the role. And when we looked at that word complicated earlier, you know, many of the challenges actually do arise from the complexity of the actual role of an educational leader. And we'll unpack those in a minute. The other key area is the problems and challenges that are arising from the different interactions that leaders have with the many stakeholders that they have. And again, I'll unpack those in a fair bit more detail too. But the third category here is one that we've added, and that is the problems, the more recent problems arising, you know, from global events and contexts. So we'll unpack some of those too. They're by no means a complete list, but you know, there's plenty to talk about and think about. But it does start to bring up some of the important things that you need to consider. So let's talk about, you know, one of the first areas, the complex nature of the role, and what's been defined as, or described as, the management challenge. And I'll talk about an example too in a minute. So the management challenge is relating to the management model and the poor leadership that might be introduced, you know, or implemented. For example, many challenges and problems arise from the tensions from leader being a leader, and you know, the management sides of the role as well, you know, needing to lead and manage at the same time. When you're trying to implement a model such as instructional leadership, as a case example, many schools and educational communities are implementing ideas around instructional leadership, you know, with as a strategy to increase the performance outcomes of their students. And many schools are using different approaches to how to implement strategies to support instructional leadership. But often what you find, you know, in relation to that challenge is that the leader can get caught between the day-to-day immediate tasks and then the need to develop a leadership which is wholly centered on student learning, in particular, as would be intended by an instructional leadership strategy, for example. And some of those challenges also relate to the need to distribute leadership and increase delegation. I mean, some leaders, some principals in particular, find that they're doing so much of the work that it's not sustainable, and they face challenges around being able to distribute that. One case example, for example, of how a school might, and a school leader might be implementing strategy there, is implementing an instructional leadership model. Local schools, for example, along the surf coast of Victoria, and the school is a large secondary school, and the leaders are looking to implement instructional models to support learning in those school communities. But they find talking about the instructional model is one thing, but doing it is another thing in that sense. And so the leader is challenged to be able to not only manage the day-to-day activities, but also to help lead and develop other leaders. You know, that's a part of the more distributed approach to leadership. So in this context, the strategy that's used is where the principal delegates to a couple of other instructional leaders, 2 or 3 high-performing teachers who become instructional leaders, whose role it is to work with colleagues to implement the model of instructional leadership they're looking at. What we've been doing with those school leaders and with the school is using some of our digital technology, which involves 360-degree cameras and immersive learning environments. And so what we do is we film those teachers using a 360-degree camera. So the whole classroom is recorded, and we capture everything that's happening in the context of that space. What happens is the teacher is mic'd up, so we record the audio and the 360 video, and what it does is provide the opportunity to then come back into our immersive learning environment, Deacon, or an Imaginarium, as we've often called it, which is a large 360-degree theatre, and we in and we ask them to see, you know, what's invisible in plain sight, often happening in the classroom. So the strategy involves one of recording teachers using those recordings as what you can call a mirror device. And the mirror device starts to highlight the opportunity to reflect on what's really happening in detail. And teachers can see things that they often miss within the classroom, and the teachers can then start to see, well, actually we're doing a lot of teaching, but the students are very passive. So that learning using the immersive learning, that digital affordance, for example, then allows us to encourage the teachers to become more reflective and reflexive as a part of implementing that instructional leadership strategy. That's actually just a picture of within the 360-degree theatre room. For example, if I used the video, it would probably cause problems for bandwidths and things like that, because it is 360-degree video. But when you look inside the theatre, this video recording, for example, this one's of a primary classroom, and they're learning literacy. What the teachers start to see is many of the things that are happening, how they're implementing their instructional model. They can work with the school leader to see some of the challenges. So interestingly, though, being able to reflect on all of the things that influence learning in this environment, they can start to see how the desks are laid out, very obvious things like that, and how that encourages self-regulation from the students and learning to become independent. But they can also see other things that happen. Start to see things like they've celebrated students' work by posting it all over the windows and the walls, and often in primary classrooms you'll see that sort of celebration of students' work. But from the perspective of children who suffer from degrees of autism, for example, they start to see the impact of that on providing too much stimulation. So these are the things that this is a metaphor in a sense for a mirror, and being able to see what's happening inside your own classroom, not just as a fly on the wall, but in there with other colleagues who are also looking at what's going on, within that classroom. I mean, the world of digital technology provides a huge number of affordances now, and the little 360-degree cameras that you can get are only a matter of a couple of $100 that you can use to record what happens in your classrooms, and then use that as a mirror device when you're starting to think about supporting things like instructional leadership. The thing I would highlight, though, is the methodology that we utilize in implementing those strategies for change, is that you implement the possibility to see contradictions and to see discontinuities, from what you intend to be happening compared to what is actually happening. And when you have in the room, a number of people, this room will hold up to 20 adults, for example, 25 adults even, all in the same room. So you can bring half school to see what's happening, for example. That provides you with the opportunity to talk about it from many different perspectives. So, I mean, immersive digital technology provides a great strategy for implementing things like instructional leadership and change. So that's just one of the areas, though, in the process, needing a strategy to balance the need for leading change and leading strategy, from the big picture point of view, also having to manage the day-to-day. Principals around the world find that as a significant challenge. And I'll look through a number of the others. I mean, many principals talk about the difficulties in managing the ordinary demands of the jobs, and they're often about or often related to the lack of resources that might have in their own school setting, or the limited budget that they might be working within their own school setting, or in some cases it might be budget cuts. And why is it important to acknowledge that complex part of the role? Because this impacts your capacity to lead change and strategy. And if you're not recognizing that to start with, or if you're not addressing the need to change some of these elements, then the odds are that you're going to struggle, or the strategy may not work properly, because these are all related to what you can think about as the architecture for strategy and change, I think. So I will go through more of these points, and there's a few of them. And I'm hoping that you will be able to relate to some of them, and that's what I'm encouraging you to do, is to think about, you know, some of these propositions, again, derived from the research from many countries across the world, and think about it in the context of your own school, your own community, and what it means for the changes that you're thinking about. Do you need to include some elements of these as a part of the strategy? At the very least, you need to acknowledge, you know, some aspects of it, the bits that are most relevant. So if resources budgets are not, that's fine, you don't have to worry about that. So other elements include, again, many school principals will talk about the difficulties in managing resources such as school buildings that might need, you know, a fair bit of infrastructure change and things like that. The middle of last week, I was in one of our schools, our primary schools, in one of the outer regions of Victoria, in one of the rural areas of Victoria. And the school itself was built in 1886. And that was the heart of the school. That was built at a time when, if you read in Australia, you know, the expectation, in particular Victoria, what teachers were expected to do in 1886, they were expected to bring their own lumps of coal, get to work early in the day to light the fire for the pupils, and you probably get, you know, where I'm going with that. It was built at a time which was very different, you know, to where we are today. In that school community, though, 1886 was the central part of the building. You could also see every couple of years there was a new addition that had been added. So you could actually, walking through the school, which was quite a long school, they just kept adding ends, you know, to the school. You actually were walking through history, through the 1970s, through the 1990s, you know, with every investment, you know, in school building. So principals and school leaders and leading teachers need to manage some of the adverse conditions sometimes at our school buildings and infrastructures. If that is part of the challenge that needs to be considered in terms of your leadership, or in terms of change, what I'm saying here is that sometimes that might need to be built into your strategy. So we're not just talking about leading change that happens within the classroom. It's starting to think about how you lead change that goes beyond and outside the classroom as well, not just, you know, in terms of teachers and students. So many principals talk about the difficulties in managing their jobs around inequity, inclusion, cultural diversity. These are the big challenges that they often talk about. Changing demographics, managing diversity in communities. Some of you may relate to the challenges of schools where there's high concentrations of disadvantage, both social and economic disadvantage in those school communities. And, you know, good examples of how a change approach, you know, to leadership in those communities is different to, say, a school community where there's higher levels of economic wealth and so on, is that in many cases, you know, well, in one case, for example, where departments might have rolled out, you know, buildings that were big, large, flexible learning places, flexible learning spaces, as they're often called. In those school communities where those large, flexible learning spaces are used, the teachers have the challenge of the concentration of disadvantage. They might have 150 students, you know, in the one room, very large room, albeit, which is quite different, you know, to other school settings where economic disadvantage is not as significant. So the strategies need to address that situation, you know, the relationship of the diversity, both in terms of cultural, socioeconomic, and you know, the school that you're working with in those contexts. So further on the complexity, many leaders will relate to this. Some of you may relate to this, the need to deal with the legacy of the previous leader. And that's often the first thing that a leader has to contend with. And this is a very deep challenge that needs to be considered in establishing strategy. If you're implementing digital learning in a school where there was a very anti-digital learning approach, you know, or where the values and the culture were quite resistant to the implementation of that, then the issue is around some of those embedded values and cultures that are around that. And often leaders will find that it may conflict with the new vision and the new values and the new priorities So in that sense, that needs to be acknowledged. And, strategy and change needs to account for that as a part of the process, because this is part of the fabric of what you're working with. This is the community who are going to implement the change. So increasingly, we find that principals are also talking about the increasing number and difficulty of the responsibilities that they have. And many leaders, again, relate to this challenge. Managing relationships within and across the school community, and also in particular their health and safety. I'm a head of school and dean of our School of Education, for example. If within my School of Education there's a culture of bullying, I'm accountable for that. And that nowadays is much more significant. If you're implementing change and strategy, and there are issues that need to be addressed, they need to be addressed in that sense. But likewise, bullying and those sorts of things that may impact schools, a bit more obvious, but perhaps one of the more common issues is the way teachers work together. If you're a secondary school, for example, you might find that the specialist teachers tend to work only in their specialist areas and not very well working across their specialist areas. Often, we talk about that in terms of them working in silos. You need to manage the relationships there and build that strategy around. If you're expecting teachers to work across their disciplines, that is going to be counter-cultural and often counterintuitive, for some teachers, particularly if you're using more joined up approaches in some of your strategies to improve learning outcomes for students. 75% of the leaders, according to that research, say that this has become a very significant part, almost too complex for them. The point to take away too, though, is that in many cases, it reflects the lack of skills and the lack of support and the lack of professional training and education that they may or may not have had to help develop these skills. These challenges come with skills that you can acquire and build on and learn to address, and many good leaders do that exactly. So other issues around balancing work and personal life, for example, often lead to managing stress and anxiety. And I've highlighted that one because it's a significant issue for teachers all over the world, particularly on the back of, the pandemic, hopefully getting out of our global pandemic. Many teachers have been trying to do many things at the same time and doing remote learning, for example, learning new things, new technologies, whilst also learning how to manage the students in groups whilst they're online. And then the leader of a school has to ensure, that those things are implemented fairly quickly, but often under pressure. But you need to manage stress and anxiety. Just this morning in our School of Education, and Ben was in that School of Education too meeting, we put together our work and life working party that was presenting to our own School of Education with about 130 academics in our School of Education, for example, in a way to try and manage our life and our work balance. But that's an important part of leadership too, in helping lead people to balance their lives so that they don't stress too much and so that they're not over anxious. So you can see that many of these elements are related to the complex nature of the role. And that's what the research is talking about. The leadership role itself, whatever you have in terms of a principal or a senior leader's role, there are themes that go across them all. Again, another one which is very common is this notion of increased paperwork and administrative tasks leading to overload, dealing with tight timeframes and not enough time to do the thinking that we need to do as leaders and teachers. And the question is, what do you do about that? The first question being, do we need all that paperwork? And there's a big push in Australia at the moment around reducing the amount of administration and paperwork that teachers have to do to try and get them into classrooms and teaching more of their day. So there are growing strategies to do that. But again, this is one of the areas where digital affordances have been very significant. I mean, we've been using Zoom for a number of years now across the whole of the world to to do things that might have otherwise taken, a much longer time. Unfortunately, sometimes the Zoom might have created more meetings for us because they're very easy to create meetings. But being able to use the digital affordances to try and decrease the amount of administrative or demands. One other example related to that, in roles where I've had in leadership, particularly instructional leadership in education, is where we ask our unit chairs, our leaders of units, to review the quality of their teaching, self-review every trimester. And we have about 65,000 students at Deakin University, so we have a lot of students. We're a big institution, and the executive dean at the top, for example, who's has a high level of responsibility, as does the deputy vice chancellor for education and academic. The way we were able to connect, what's happening on the ground in our classrooms to all the way up to the top of the one of the most senior executive leaders was using digital forms, where they reviewed their performance, and that provided enough information quickly and accurately to let the leaders who are making decisions about resources and quality products and so on to make better decisions. And it reduced the amount of paperwork as well, and improves the communication substantially. This point about isolation is another really important point, and those of you who are leaders will relate to this, particularly the ones who are leaders or emerging leaders. You've just come into leadership, for the first time, and you note the change. If you've come from being a teacher, a high-performing teacher, for example, you start to note the change in the relationships that come with leadership, and many leaders start to feel the isolation that comes with that. And importantly, if you're in a large institution, you can potentially start to feel the loss of proximity and the connection. From a staff member, they might say you've become out of touch, for example. From your perspective, you've lost the proximity of being amongst the people who are doing the teaching. That requires a strategy to deal with that. If you're becoming a leader or moving into leadership, most good leaders have the capacity to stay connected to what happens on the ground, as they say, and they implement strategies to do that, to make sure that they know what is actually happening. Without that, often what can happen with leadership is that leadership becomes so distant, they lose touch with reality, and they start to fear that everyone's going to poison them or something like that, as unfortunately happens in other spheres of the world. But it is important for leaders to grapple with this notion of potential isolation that comes with being a leader. It's a challenging job, and people, leadership comes with the power and the authority and the resources, and what it needs to come with is the wisdom as well. But many of those things, require learning to how to be a leader, as those additional things, and that relates to your professional identity. And what it means to be a leader. If you've become a leader from being a very successful teacher, but you've not had adequate preparation and training, many leaders actually find that to be quite a struggle, because they're no longer a teacher, but now they're a leader, but they're not sure exactly what that identity means. So again, there's need to support that. That's more of a personal thing than a strategy, but it's, if the personal strategy is recognizing it, then that's a good start. And so those points about professional learning, again, just reiterating those, many leaders will talk about, a limited induction into the role. Often they've come into the role suddenly because another leader left suddenly, or someone was sick. Or the new opportunity has arisen, but the theme is that they've often had inadequate training and preparation, and they want more. And what do they need to learn? I think when you start to understand the complexity of the role and how it impacts leaders, it actually jumps out right at you, the areas that our school leaders need to learn in terms of being effective leaders, and then using those to develop effective strategy and change. This notion of continuous improvement is a common theme, but knowing what to do with the data that you get, requires skills. And often many leaders will talk about professional learning was only ever considered to be an optional thing. So expectations around that, and some scarcity of professional feedback as well. As a leader, it's incredibly important that you do get feedback, from the people that you're leading, those people that you're leading in the most immediate parts of your leadership teams, but importantly, feedback from the people who are in the broader community that are a part of your leadership as well. They are the people who can make or break the change. So many leaders talk about very specific areas, such as their financial skills, managing the complexity of change, the interpersonal skills that they need, and often increasingly the legal skills. And the research highlights those. And again, the limited time is a theme that's often been talked about in terms of leadership development. So those really summarize many of the points from the research about the complexity of the leadership role. But there's also much that's been written about and published about in relation to the challenges and problems arising from interactions with different stakeholders. So there's the complexity of the role, and then there's the interactions with stakeholders that we're talking about. So I've highlighted those in yellow here. And we'll just talk about a couple of those quickly as well. And a common theme that arises in the research is about leaders' thoughts on the lack of autonomy that they often have. So many leaders will talk about wanting to have more autonomy, but in some situations, they'll also talk about the tensions between having more autonomy through a decentralization process where they're relating to departments of education, for example, or other organizations that they're accountable to. But increasingly, they struggle with being accountable and being controlled through other mechanisms and means. So that's often a challenge where there's high levels of decentralization, but there's manipulation and control through other mechanisms as well. So having the autonomy to make decisions, but also having the skills and the knowledge required to sustain effectiveness under those circumstances is something that's of critical importance. In terms of leading strategy and change, the question is, to what extent do you have autonomy in your decision making, and what can you make decisions about with confidence? What do you need further consultation about, beyond your immediate realm, for example, to make decisions about? And each context is different. And often, some of the leaders globally will talk about wanting more support from authorities. In many cases, they receive wonderful support, but in some cases, they often report that many of the challenges are from, their data being challenged, the performance being challenged, but not being supported around those and what to do from those things. And sometimes the challenge is also related to different parts of the different organizations that may contradict each other sometimes. So other interactions with stakeholders, having insufficient financial resources from outside the school is a very significant one. Challenges and concerns related to the physical conditions of the school, but the building maintenance, for example, depending on an external provider. When you're setting about your ambitions in your school community and you're looking to implement digital change, do you have the resources within your own realm to implement those? Do you need to work with people beyond, to implement those? Many schools will build into their change and strategy models of partnershiping, particularly where they're implementing digital change, and partnerships with digital organizations are incredibly important, to bring about effective change, not just in terms of the knowledge that they have for technology partners, but in terms of the resources and the focus that they bring too. So another very significant theme globally is around recruiting leaders into the role of leadership. And we find that many of our leaders are aging, Many of our departments in government are challenged by, the challenge to recruit new principals and leaders. Some report that the leadership role is not as attractive as it used to be. Others might face issues around, gender imbalance and high turnover of leadership. So these often depend on contexts, and they vary across the globe in terms of, one theme though is we find that it's increasingly probable that younger teachers in schools are more likely to get promoted to leadership levels faster because of this. And as a consequence of that, they may find themselves in situations where they're expected to lead strategy and change without adequate preparation, again, around this notion of leadership. So it's one thing to be a good teacher, and we need more good teachers, but it's another thing to be a good leader. And without developing the skill sets that you need to do that, then that's when often people get burnt out in the role. And then this notion of accountability, which again is another theme. Often the pressure around accountability, public league tables, for example, principals find very difficult to contend with. All right, if you're doing well, but if you're not, it actually creates significant challenges. So the interactions with stakeholders, again, around this notion of high job complexity, many principals would report that the intensification of the job and the pervasiveness of it and the multitasking that's required is one of the biggest challenges that they have. So by that I mean, they'll go home at night very late feeling, very tired. And these are the signs that something needs to be done in terms of the sustainability, and that needs to be considered if you're building about a strategy to implement change. Leaders need to look after themselves. What do you do is the big question in terms of managing that. It comes to the model of leadership that you might be using, and often people will use a much more distributed approach. They'll seek to build the capabilities in those other people around them to also take leadership roles and build their leadership team, to have a much more distributed approach to leadership amongst their group. And often not a great strategy for people who tend to be more authoritarian in their leadership style. But, I think that's where the situation needs to be considered in terms of where you're starting at. And salaries, of course, sometimes may not be as proportional to the work. This one is often one of the big ones. I'll summarize them very quickly in one form there, but it's often the one that takes up a lot of the management side of things. But remember, the staff are the people who implement the change in your school too. Often problems that a school leader might be having where there's a recurrent issue of underperformance from a teacher, and they might be in a critical area, the year 9, for example, or the year 6 classroom. But this presents some significant challenges. If you're building, a vision for the school and you've devised a strategy to implement it, and you're grappling with low teacher morale, a high number of teachers who aren't performing, then that strategy, if it's not addressing some of those elements, does need to, be rethought, I think, at the operational level in particular. Pardon me. So these themes you probably relate to, encouraging teachers to work collaboratively, addressing resistance to adopting new technologies and methodologies in particular, because in some cases it might require teachers to change identities. And I'll come to that point when we start to talk more about the architecture, the strategic architecture. And then problems related to students. There's only a couple here, but this could actually be many more than this. But student behaviour challenges take a lot of a leader's time, whatever level you're at. If you're a year level leader, for example, or if you're a principal, the behavioural challenges may be a part of the strategy for change that you're trying to incorporate. And I guess if you acknowledge that you have some challenges. If you do have some challenges, then that should be incorporated. If you don't, then that's a good thing, that you can rely on low levels of problems related to students, and the way they behave, and supporting them. One thing that is more common across the board, though, is this notion that many students, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, are more likely to be coming to school with some experience of trauma of some description, independent of the socioeconomic circumstances that your school's in. And that might arise from, populations of students, who are coming from refugee backgrounds, for example, and presenting in classrooms in high rates and so on, and much greater diversity of the students within the populations. And then the parents, of course, and the community. Often principals will talk about, this as being a challenge. If you have strong support, that's a good thing that you can rely on building strategy. But on the other hand, if you find that your parents are resistant to change and they don't want to change, then that needs to be a part of your considerations in designing a change strategy. So it's amazing how many parent teacher meetings and school meetings with parents, council meetings will spend so much time on talking about short socks or long socks, for example. So some very simple things: should they have long socks or should they have short socks? And some very simple things can sometimes create very long meetings for principals. But poverty is another case example. That one I was talking about earlier, where you have a lower socioeconomic community with limited resources, financial resources in the community, and then you're trying to implement change, but that change needs to account for the for the levels of poverty, if that's one of the issues that are being experienced by the leadership within your school, in that sense. But in the global context, the challenges are many now, and this is more recent. But the pandemic has created some of the enduring challenges that we now need to consider, when we're talking about changing school communities, and one of them, is the level of motivation and the degree of tiredness that many of our school communities have coming out of the pandemic, dealing with new challenges. If you're looking at working with your teachers, for example, helping teachers implement new strategies for teaching, then there needs to be significant respect for the work that they've been doing over the past couple of years, in particular out of the pandemic. But other issues around that, and on that point, particularly as they deal with students who themselves are struggling to get back into classrooms after having lockdowns and things like that. Pardon me. But when you start to go across some of those other areas, migrating populations, the media are increasingly more intrusive into what happens in schools, cybersecurity, the affordances that come with digital networks, but also the risks as well. And this last one is a very significant one. Let's have a quick drink of water, sorry. So out of all that, what's the significant takeaway? I mean, the complexity of the job, being a leader, the complexity of working with the stakeholders, being a leader, does bring challenges and problems. Pardon me. The important thing is to acknowledge those challenges within the context of your school communities. And by acknowledging those challenges within the context of their school communities, and you will know within your own communities, you will know what those challenges are. The question is, to what extent do you need to incorporate or address some of those challenges as a part of your development of strategy and change, because they are important elements that impact the capacity, to implement change. And I'll just draw from some of the material, for example, that we use in our programs on leadership. An important one is thinking about, just one of the several here, adopted from Davy's work, is this notion of the strategic architecture of a school. If you think about this diagram as representing the strategic architecture of a school, you'll start to see, as you work around, how those challenges and problems are woven in, and the culture and the values is a big part of that. And the question starts to come, well, how do you address is the culture and the challenge the culture and the values, the right culture and values that you need to implement the change, or do you need to address those cultures and values, and do you need strategy to address those cultures and values? Do you have adequate shared beliefs, for example, and norms that underpin? Often leadership and strategy will focus just on this area, unfortunately, and not spend enough time thinking about the culture and focus more so on learning itself. Where the focus predominantly on learning, but not recognizing that learning happens within a culture, and it happens as a set of relationships in action, and it happens because resources are implemented and put into action. Then you find that the strategies that are used to try and improve learning, for example, are inadequate, and so they often miss the key things that influence the capacity for them to implement. One of the approaches that you can use, that we've used very effectively, is being able to identify those discontinuities that work across this architecture, for example, things that are discontinuities, and thus going back to that example where we've used the 360-degree cameras to record classrooms in action, but helping the teachers to see those discontinuities themselves, so they own the conversation, they own the narrative, they own the data about their teaching and learning, and that helps them stimulate the need for change, for example. So rather than being told, they can see that although they're doing all the right things, 60% of the class might be asleep, for example, or actually very passive, and yet we're trying to encourage them to be much more active in their learning. So seeing that the strategic architecture of a school in terms of the culture and the values, the ideas around learning that create the architecture of the school, the resources that you're relying on, and also the sorts of relationships. And many of those have been highlighted in those challenges, many of the relationships, both internally and externally. You can think in terms of strategic leadership. Intelligence is another way that's often thought, again, drawing on Davey's work here, and there's a number of different ways that we talk about this within some of our programs, our master's programs and so on. But in terms of leaders' strategic intelligence, you can think about leaders having people wisdom, for example, and leaders having contextual wisdom as ways of knowing, and ways of being a leader, and the work that they do around encouraging participation and developing approaches to shared information, genuinely creative approaches to thinking that encourages continuous improvement, how they motivate, build capability and the competencies of colleagues, and then within the context, the wisdom of a leader in being able to really understand what's happening in their communities. This is one of the things that works well when you provide them with the opportunity to reflect in action, not just leaders, but also those people who are a part of their leadership communities. How you develop those shared values and shared beliefs, often can be done by having that shared experience that brings the contradictions between beliefs and values to the surface. And that points to thinking about strategic approaches, procedural wisdom, and strategic processes. Again, when you start to package them all together, can be talked about as strategic leadership in itself. And again, there's many variations around what constitutes the cycle of strategic leadership, and the theme that runs through most of them, though, is the cyclic dimension of being strategic, where you go through the stages of planning. Now, who you involved in that and how you develop the planning is just as important as the stage itself. But then you start to implement the processes of operationalizing the plan, how that works and how it's resourced, the processes of monitoring and reviewing, and then bringing about change to make sure it's sustainable as well, and maintaining the change. Often planning and implementation stages are done quite well in many strategic plans, but often there's limited work done on having capacity to review and monitor what the changes are, and unfortunately it's a common theme in schools around the world that great innovations have been implemented, through strategic planning and change, but often they're not sustained, or often they don't stick because of the lack of monitoring and review and the need to change some of those cultural elements, for example, that will change them. And that goes back to seeing it through the lens of that strategic architecture. So in thinking about implementing strategic change and thinking about all of those things that we've talked about, that the research tells us about the challenges and problems that principals and leaders face, in bringing about change, then you can think about some key steps that are involved. And those key steps can be summarized under those sorts of things in terms of the development of the vision. When you're looking at implementing change, the shared vision is critical. Have you developed the opportunity for a shared vision? Have you considered fully what skills that you need to develop? Have you considered the sorts of incentives that our teachers and community will need to bring about that change? The sorts of the resources that will enable the change, and then the action plan. So some of those questions that I've just highlighted there, again, draw from some of our material on thinking about leadership, strategy and change, really start to highlight the parts that you can implement. But in asking these questions, I'll keep going back to addressing the situated problems and challenges that you might be facing that many leaders might find in common. And that brings us to our last slide. And that is focusing on, some key takeaways about leading change. And again, this brings together much of the research about leading change. And if, for example, you're looking to implement, a whole of school approach to digital learning, or even a whole of region approach, for example, the research shows that you need to have some sense of urgency or some genuine need for change. And that's where having a stimulus, in the form of data or some sort of a mirror device to stimulate people to reflect on and come to terms with the need to change in the first place is not enough to just tell them. You actually need to be able to show them and help them come to that understanding for themselves. And the point about being able to identify discontinuities and contradictions is a very helpful tool in helping people understand the sense of urgency. But some of the other key approaches, building the team or building a coalition. How will you build that coalition? This is an important part of sustainability and distributing the leadership. Setting the vision and the strategy. Will you use a co-developed approach? Again, one of the big challenges, that leaders have, they might know the answer, they might know what needs to be done, and then they just tell everybody to do it, compared to they might know the answer, but they bring other people on board and they help them understand, and they co-develop the strategy and their approach. But they also co-develop the leadership as a part of that strategy. And that's where distributing leaders, other leaders who become a part of the implementation. How well is the vision communicated and the strategy? How well do you enable and empower people to act? Because that also addresses the capacity for them to address some of the barriers that they will face when you're looking to implement, deep change in particular. It's important to celebrate the successes, the short terms, but make sure that you keep focused on the long-term goals always to keep people motivated. And it's also to make sure you consolidate progressive gains. Often, in talking about that, when you start to implement change, it does require people to behave differently, to adopt new values, and influences the culture of your organization. But without having deep change, sometimes the other parts of the organization might pull it back to where it was before. And I'm sure most of you, have been involved in some amazing innovations that reverted back to, where they were, because those other parts of the strategic architecture were not addressed to sustain the change. And then finally, that makes the point about anchoring the change in what becomes a new culture. So in leading strategy and change, it's vital to think about the culture and the local situatedness that you're working with, and how that influences your, not just the setting of the strategy, who you work with, but the operational approaches that you might use to implement that change and achieve the vision as well. So lots to think about. I hope you found some of that useful at least. That brings us to the end of the presentation. So I will just again note Ben Arnold, who will be in and helping us answer some of the questions. If you have some questions, Ben's our director of our Master of Education, Leadership and Learning. So you'll hear from Ben as well. Thank you.
Many thanks, Professor Damian. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I'm sure there are a lot of questions coming through on the chat, as well as those who are here. We already have a few, so I will be asking a couple of questions. And then if it's okay, could I also trouble Dr. Ben to moderate some of the questions that are coming through, just to help ease with some of them that we might have missed from our side, and then we'll go through the flow. Yeah. So I'll start with an easy one for you, Professor Damian. You did bring up the question around the 360-degree camera. So you mentioned this a couple of times across your presentation. So the question was around written consent. Did you implement written consent to the parents before you used the 360-degree camera?
Absolutely. I mean, we don't film unless we have written consent from the parents. And, you know, we will not use any footage, you know, unless we have that. So they have to absolutely provide consent. And interestingly, you know, on that point, you can use consent forms in the forms of paper, but we've created a new digital consent form as well, just to reduce the paperwork on that sense, which makes it easier for the parents too.
Perfect. That brings back to a good question around ICT. So you talked about, you know, digital forms of, you know, administrative tasks, for instance, but how do you implement an encouraging environment on ICT and technology when there are sometimes a lack of ICT facilities, or a lack of ICT skills, or even access to internet in some of the rural areas in Malaysia? What would you, how would you advise that?
Again, a good question. I think this is where, you know, the principal's leadership role and strategy needs to consider external partnerships in particular, looking at innovation that relates to how other partners might be able to resource, you know, some of the strategies. We too have parts of Australia with very poor internet access, and what happens is, you know, those school communities will work with some of the technology partners or mining companies or big organizations, for example, that often have a vested interest in supporting and developing communities. So it's not always a case of going to government for money or departments. It's a case, you know, if you can, you know, looking to be innovative in terms of bringing your resources from elsewhere.
Yeah, I'd just add to that. It doesn't have to, if there isn't internet access, it could be using digital technologies without internet access. So looking for those partnerships, even in the absence of internet access, where it may be a computer or an iPad or some kind of device that students can still interact with and engage with offline. Those sorts of innovative approaches are important, I think.
Thank you so much. Before we jump back into the online questions again, is there a question on the floor that I could address right now really quickly? Anybody? Okay, so I think for the moment we are still shy. So we'll go back on to questions from online. Ben, could I trouble you to raise them to Professor Damian yourself?
Sure. So one of the questions was around changing of infrastructure can be materialized, but how do you change the mindset of everybody involved in the education ecosystem, from policymakers through to staff members in schools and parents?
A really good question that really summarizes a lot of the challenges that educational leaders, we use a strategy which is called a formative intervention. And a formative intervention, again, informed by research, what it essentially comes down to is we try to put together around the table those people who are the stakeholders. For example, in that classroom, that 360-degree classroom, we put in the room the people who design the architecture for classrooms. We put the Department of Education who funds the classrooms. We've even had people in there who are health professionals, OTs, occupational therapists, and teachers and leaders, of course. But it's using that multi-stakeholder approach around one shared experience, and that's where data, or other ways of providing a mirror device, a reflection on what's actually happening as a part of that works incredibly well. I could give you 100 stories about how that's worked well, particularly ones that are derived from the pandemic, but looking for discontinuities and contradictions that are across the stakeholders is a really effective way, to try and align people's intentions. And that's the bit where if you start to change people's understandings of what their part of their organization exists for, then you end up with sustainable change. So rather than just funding buildings, for example, it might be that part of the department understands that their role is actually improving learning outcomes. It's not just funding buildings. So in that sense, there's a lot of power in using that approach, and it works incredibly well.
Perfect. So thank you so much. There is a question on the floor, if I could interrupt. And if you could.
Hi, Lani Ibrahim from IAB. We have jumped into ICT and changes within the digital training as well. Lock, stock, and barrel without even considering the consequences or whatever is going on within the digital community. But however, I'm looking at how significant or important is digital maturity in terms of education management or the managers of education to understand what is digital implementation, or as you say, changes that needs to be done. How significant is that, rather than just talking about the infrastructure or changes in terms of the middle management, but how about the top management? How important is that?
That's another good question, because often that's the level where priorities are made, resources are committed. My approach, and Ben, I'm keen to hear what your thoughts are here too. My perspective is that it's vital. But you need for your leaders at the highest level to understand what can be gained, what the benefits are. Often, if those leaders are talking about, and thinking about balancing all of those challenges that they have as a leader, one big part of it might be managing the money, for example, for the organization. The question comes down to what can be gained versus what is the cost. And that's where you need the power of a forceful argument, and I believe that it's vital, for educational leaders to seriously understand the significance of digital infrastructure and the affordances that digital tools bring now. There's no going back.
Absolutely.
What's your
I
thoughts,
completely agree with that. I think in terms of the future, there's only going to we need to prepare students for a digital future. There's no doubt about that. I think in terms of your point really in the presentation about being strategic at the ministry level, at the policy making level, really some long-term thinking and planning about the kinds of skills that we want students to learn. And that really is a focus more on learning to use technologies and less about, I think there's sometimes a temptation to sort of jump towards the latest technology or the latest software. And I think there's a bit of a risk there. So some real strategic planning around what are the kinds of skills, knowledge, values that we want students to take forward into a digital future. And then that also applies at the school level as well. In different contexts, there's going to be different levels of access. There's going to be different levels of digital knowledge and digital awareness. So how at the school level do school leaders mediate that? I think that's really about having some good guidance at a senior level, being able to engage with the latest research around digital learning and digital literacy, and then also making decisions that are based on what's going on in your community and the needs of your community, and also the kind of access that they have to digital technologies.
If you're a middle level leader and you're trying to influence the leaders who are at the next level, Sometimes we call that managing up.
Perfect. I think we have almost come to time, but we have one last question, actually, just from a general point of view. If I could trouble you, Professor Damian, if members of our audience would like to explore options for further study, such as a master's program, for instance, where would they go to find more information?
For sure. We've got our website, our Deakin website, the Master of Education Leadership and Learning. It's a brand new course, for example. It's all on our Deakin website, and we can make that available afterwards as well to anyone who's interested. But it's a new course that Ben's leading, and we've tried to keep it tight, very purposeful, very focused, but it does account for those bigger questions that leaders are now responsible for in the world that we're living in now. So Ben, I don't know whether you want to add some more. You've got the connection there. Ben's put it in the chat. So you can just open that link. And that course is online too. So it can be done from your bedroom if you want to do it that way.
That's it. So I've put the details in there, and I'll just put my email address in there if there are any specific questions about the course. Happy to answer those as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. If I made trouble for the slides to come back up, I think it's by my colleague this time. So, there is a final question. It seems we're getting a question from our STC, Paul. Sorry, Paul. You need to speak out, otherwise our online audience won't be able to hear you. No, you just have to turn it back on. No.
Sorry to interrupt. Yes, great. Really fantastic presentation. So thank you very, very much, Professor Damian and Ben. Thank you. Shri, I have one question, please. What do we do in answering all of the 50-odd other questions that we had from our online participants? Very interested to know how we're going to address that. Thank you.
They will be taken on notice, and if Ben and Professor Damian would like to answer that really quickly.
Sure.
So I'm happy to respond to those. Shall I share the questions now?
So I noticed, so we went through a lot of those questions, and most of them are actually very kindly our participants saying hi. So they're not actually 50 questions. So for Paul's sake, there were a few more I think we definitely did not address. But like I said, we will take them on notice, and we'll make sure that the Deakin team will address that to you separately, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, we can sort of go through them, look for the themes, and then perhaps produce a response that addresses some of those themes, I guess, that we could make available to, as a follow-up. So, and we really do appreciate the level of engagement, today.
Indeed. Thank you so much to, like I said, to all the audiences who have been here, both online as well as in person. And so may I ask all our members to provide your feedback on our survey. So this input is highly valuable to the project team, both here with Austrade as well as MDEC, as it determines whether we are continuing such training resources in the future. Please scan the QR code with your phone and or click on the link provided on the chats. And I'll just wait a few seconds for you to do that. And then we'll go on to our next few slides because we're coming into time. So if that's okay, I'll trouble Erwin to go to the next slide. Perfect. So for the moment, our next session in this series will be delivered by the University of Sydney, specifically for secondary school teachers, held on the 8th of November. This session will be focusing on the best practice for inspiring STEM subjects and study in students. So please, again, use the QR code on this slide or the link on the chats to register your attendance. Once again, all the attendees, very much like today, will receive a certificate from the university at the end of the session. Next slide, please. Perfect. So we're unfortunately now, coming out right on to time. So if I may start with a very big thank you to our speakers today from Deakin University, Professor Damian Blake and Dr. Ben. So if I can get an applause since we have an audience. Thank you so much. And may I also thank the Ministry of Education and MDEC, as well as our attendees, both here in person, as well as those online who have participated. We look forward to delivering the Education 4.0 over the course of November. For those attending in person, if you have any questions still, please feel free to stay. We do have refreshments, and obviously you can connect with our Associate Professor Awanti here, as well as Ms. Bree from Deakin University, who have traveled all the way from Australia. So with that, may I formally close our online webinar, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.